In 525 BCE, the mighty Egyptian Empire, builders of the pyramids, masters of the Nile, unconquered for centuries, fell to Persian invaders not through superior weapons or tactics, but because their soldiers refused to shoot arrows at cats. This is the true story of history's most bizarre military victory. Picture this: 50,000 Egyptian warriors died because they wouldn't harm cats. Not metaphorical cats, not soldiers dressed as cats, actual, living, meowing cats. The fall of Egypt's last native dynasty changed the ancient world forever, and it happened because one Persian king discovered the ultimate psychological weapon. By the end of this video, you'll understand how one Persian king's twisted genius turned Egypt's greatest strength, their faith, into their ultimate downfall. You'll discover the sacred animal shield that paralyzed an entire army. You'll meet the traitor who revealed Egypt's fatal weakness. And you'll witness why the young pharaoh's first battle became his last. How could this happen? How did cats end up on a battlefield? What made Egyptian soldiers choose death over sacrilege? Who was the insider that betrayed Egypt's deepest secrets? How could the world's oldest civilization fall to such a bizarre tactic? How did Cambyses know this would work? The answers lie in one of history's most psychologically brilliant military campaigns. This isn't just a story about ancient warfare. It's about what happens when someone weaponizes your deepest beliefs against you. When faith becomes weakness. When devotion becomes destruction. After 3,000 years of independence, Egypt's fate was sealed in just 3 hours. The statistical shock still stuns historians. 50,000 Egyptian casualties versus just 7,000 Persian losses. But the numbers don't capture the true horror of that day outside Pelusium, when bronze met belief, and belief lost. To understand how cats conquered Egypt, we must first understand the world that made this possible. If you're fascinated by the untold stories of history's most decisive battles, where psychology trumped swords and faith decided empires, hit that like button and subscribe for more epic war content. Now, let me take you back to the scorching sands of ancient Egypt. The year 525 BCE found the ancient world in upheaval. The Persian Empire, under Cyrus the Great, had swallowed kingdoms from India to Anatolia. Now, his son, Cambyses II, known as the Mad King's heir, set his eyes on the last great independent power, Egypt. But Cambyses wasn't the battle-hardened conqueror his father was. Where Cyrus inspired loyalty through mercy, Cambyses ruled through fear. Persian nobles whispered about his violent temper, his paranoid episodes, his obsession with conquering Egypt. Some said he'd murdered his own brother to secure the throne. What they didn't know was that this instability would make him the perfect conqueror for Egypt, because only a madman would think to use cats as weapons. Across the Mediterranean, Egypt faced its own crisis. The great pharaoh Audacious II had just died, leaving the throne to his son, Psamtik III, the boy who would be pharaoh. At barely 23, Psamtik inherited an empire at its most vulnerable moment. He'd trained for ceremony, not combat. He knew rituals, not tactics. His generals were old, his army untested for generations. Egypt had relied on its geography, deserts and seas, for defense. They were about to learn that deserts couldn't stop Persians, but the real danger came from within. Enter Phanes of Halicarnassus, the traitor tactician. This Greek mercenary had served Amasis loyally for years, rising to command Egypt's foreign troops. But something history doesn't record what turned him traitor. Perhaps gold, perhaps revenge, perhaps simple ambition. What matters is that Phanes knew Egypt's deepest secret, the one thing her soldiers valued more than victory, more than their own lives. Egypt in 525 BCE was a deeply religious society. The goddess Bastet, protector of home and hearth, commanded special devotion. Her sacred animal, the cat, wasn't just revered, it was protected by law. Kill a cat, even accidentally, and face execution. Ibises, dogs, hawks, all sacred to various gods, enjoyed similar protection. Egyptians mummified millions of these animals, spending fortunes on their afterlife preparations. This wasn't mere superstition. Egyptian soldiers genuinely believed that harming these animals would curse them for eternity. Worse, it might anger the gods enough to abandon Egypt entirely. In a world where divine favor determined everything from Nile floods to military victories, this belief shaped every decision. The death of Amasis II created the perfect storm. A young, untested pharaoh, an army that hadn't faced serious threats in decades, a religion that made certain tactics unthinkable, and now, a traitor who knew exactly how to exploit these weaknesses. As Psamtik performed his coronation rituals in Memphis, Cambyses gathered his forces in Persia. The Persian war machine, 200,000 strong, veterans of a dozen conquests, prepared to march. They'd crushed the Lydians, humbled the Babylonians, absorbed the Medes. Egypt would be next. But here's where it gets insane. Cambyses wasn't planning a conventional invasion. Thanks to Phanes, he knew something no previous conqueror had understood. You didn't need to defeat Egyptian soldiers. You needed to defeat Egyptian souls. The stage was set. The boy pharaoh versus the mad prince. Ancient tradition versus ruthless innovation. Faith versus cunning. And at the center of it all, the most unlikely weapon in military history, the sacred cats of Egypt. But how did a diplomatic insult transform into a holy war? The spark came from wounded pride. Cambyses had requested a daughter of Amasis in marriage, a common diplomatic arrangement. But Amasis, perhaps sensing weakness in the Persian prince, sent a substitute, the daughter of the previous pharaoh, dressed up as his own. When Cambyses discovered the deception, his infamous rage exploded. Egypt had insulted him. Egypt would burn. But rage alone doesn't conquer empires. Cambyses needed Phanes, and Phanes delivered. The Greek traitor didn't just provide intelligence on troop positions or fortification weaknesses. Any spy could do that. He revealed the psychological blueprint of Egyptian society. He explained their religious obligations, their sacred animal laws, their spiritual paralysis when faced with certain choices. Most crucially, he identified Pelusium as Egypt's Achilles' heel. Pelusium, the gateway to Egypt, guarded the kingdom's eastern frontier. Any invasion from Asia had to pass through this fortress city. Its massive walls had repelled Assyrians and held back countless raiders. Egyptian military doctrine was simple: hold Pelusium, and Egypt stays safe. Lose it, and the fertile delta lay open to invasion. What happened next defied 3,000 years of military tradition. Cambyses assembled an army unlike any before. Yes, he had his 200,000 Persian regulars, infantry, cavalry, siege engineers. But he also issued orders that made his generals question his sanity. Collect animals. Specifically, collect cats, ibises, dogs, every creature sacred to Egyptian gods. The logistics alone seemed impossible. How do you transport thousands of cats across hundreds of miles of desert? Cambyses found unlikely allies, the Arabian tribes. These nomads, long oppressed by Egypt, gladly aided the Persian march. They provided water, guides, and most importantly, helped gather the sacred animals from Egyptian border towns. Meanwhile, Psamtik scrambled to prepare Egypt's defense. His forces were impressive on papyrus. Elite archer units who could put an arrow through a coin at 100 paces. Nubian auxiliaries whose fathers had conquered kingdoms. Greek mercenaries hardened by Mediterranean conflicts. Perhaps 80,000 men in total, with Pelusium's garrison adding another 15,000. The young pharaoh's war council brimmed with confidence. They had the defensive advantage. They had the gods' favor. Priests performed daily rituals. Sacrifices filled the temples. They had supplies to outlast any siege. What they didn't have was the one thing that mattered: the ability to imagine the unimaginable. But the Egyptians had made a fatal miscalculation. They prepared for a conventional siege, battering rams, scaling ladders, starvation tactics. They stationed their best archers on Pelusium's walls. They arranged their infantry in traditional formations. They never conceived that Cambyses would weaponize their own faith against them. Phanes, watching from the Persian camp, must have smiled. He'd lost everything. His Egyptian family had been executed as traitors, his property confiscated. But revenge was coming. He knew every Egyptian commander personally, their strengths and weaknesses. More importantly, he understood their spiritual constraints. An Egyptian archer would rather die than commit sacrilege. It was this certainty, this predictable, exploitable piety, that would doom them. The Persian army's approach took 40 days across the Arabian desert. 40 days of marching with not just soldiers and supplies, but thousands of animals. Contemporary accounts describe the surreal sight: Persian warriors sharing water with cats, cavalrymen carrying cages of ibises, supply wagons modified to transport sacred creatures. Any other army would have called it madness. Cambyses called it strategy. As the Persians neared Pelusium, Egyptian scouts reported the impossible. The enemy wasn't just bringing siege equipment, they were bringing a menagerie. Confused reports reached Psamtik. The Persians march with cats. They carry birds in cages. Dogs walk among their ranks. The young pharaoh dismissed it as desert hallucinations or enemy propaganda. Surely no commander would burden himself with animals during a military campaign. The night before battle, both armies performed their rituals. Egyptians prayed to Bastet, to Horus, to all gods who protected the two lands. Persian priests made offerings to Ahura Mazda. But Cambyses had one more ritual to perform. He personally inspected the sacred animals, ensuring they were visible, healthy, ready to serve their purpose. Here's the detail that changes everything. Cambyses didn't plan to simply release animals onto the battlefield. That would be chaos, nothing more. No, his plan was far more sinister, far more brilliant. He would make the animals part of his army's very structure, integrated into their battle line in a way that would make Egyptian resistance impossible. As dawn broke over Pelusium, neither army could imagine what sacrilege awaited. Dawn painted Pelusium's walls crimson, an omen the priests would later recall with shuddering clarity. The Egyptian army had taken position. Archers lined the fortress walls, infantry arranged in defensive formations before the gates, cavalry positioned on the flanks. Psamtik, wearing the blue war crown of pharaoh, surveyed his forces with nervous pride. His first battle would be his kingdom's greatest victory. The Persian army appeared from the desert heat like a mirage becoming real. Their approach was oddly slow, methodical. Egyptian lookouts strained to make sense of what they saw. The enemy's formation seemed wrong somehow, their front lines strangely bulky. Then came the sounds. Not just the expected thunder of marching feet and war drums, but something else. Something that made Egyptian soldiers glance at each other in confusion. Meowing. Thousands of cats crying out in the morning air. What happened next defied logic. One Egyptian survivor would later record. As the Persian front line came into arrow range, that crucial 300 yards where Egyptian archers expected to begin their deadly work, the impossible became visible. Persian soldiers had cats tied to their shields, living, crying, sacred cats strapped to their defensive equipment. Behind them, more soldiers carried poles with cages containing ibises, the sacred birds of Thoth. Dogs, sacred to Anubis, were leashed to warriors' belts. The Egyptian archers froze. Their trained instinct screamed to loose arrows, to darken the sky with bronze-tipped death. But their souls recoiled. To shoot meant risking the life of a sacred animal. Not just risking, guaranteeing. Even if they aimed for exposed flesh, some arrows would hit the creatures. It would be sacrilege. It would be damnation. But Psamtik didn't know his enemy's true weapon extended beyond the physical animals. Cambyses had ordered his men to paint images of Bastet on their shields, to wear amulets of Egyptian gods. The psychological assault was total. Every Persian soldier had transformed himself into a walking blasphemy that Egyptians couldn't attack without damning their own souls. "Draw your bows!" Psamtik's command rang out from the walls. The archers obeyed. Thousands of arrows knocked in perfect synchronization. "Take aim!" Arms drew back. Bowstrings creaked with tension. The Persians continued advancing, now at 200 yards. 150. The cat's cries grew louder. "Loose!" Nothing happened. Here and there, an archer released, aiming high, deliberately missing. Most simply stood, arrows nocked, arms trembling with the strain of held draw, tears streaming down their faces. One archer, Kenty of Memphis, would later describe the moment. "I saw a Persian dog tied to a shield, and behind it the face of a young Persian soldier, perhaps my own age. I knew I could put an arrow through his eye. I knew my duty to Pharaoh. But I also knew that to harm the sacred animal was to invite the wrath of Anubis for all eternity. My hand would not release. My soul overruled my training." This is where the story takes a sacrilegious turn. Cambyses, watching from his chariot, raised his sword. The Persian army stopped just outside accurate arrow range, about 100 yards. Then, in an act of calculated cruelty, they began their demonstration. Persian soldiers held up cats, one by one, as if presenting them to the Egyptian army. The message was clear: shoot us, and these die. The Egyptian lines began to waver. Soldiers looked to their officers, officers to their generals, generals to Psamtik. The young pharaoh faced an impossible choice: order his men to commit mass sacrilege or watch his kingdom fall. He chose a third option: negotiation. "Hold," Psamtik commanded. He would send an embassy, demand the Persians fight with honor. But Cambyses had anticipated this. When the Egyptian herald approached under a flag of truce, the Persian response was simple: "We fight with the gods of Egypt as our shields. If your gods abandon you, perhaps they were never yours to begin with." Then Cambyses gave the order that would echo through eternity. The Persian army resumed its advance. Slowly, inexorably, they walked toward Egyptian lines. No charge, no battle cries, just the steady approach of men who knew their enemies were already defeated. But the cats were just the beginning of Cambyses' psychological warfare. As the armies closed, Persian soldiers began calling out in broken Egyptian, "Bastet protects us. Your gods march with Persia. Strike us down and damn yourselves." The religious taunting shattered Egyptian morale like hammer blows on glass. Some Egyptian units tried to fight. A group of Nubian auxiliaries, less bound by Egyptian religious law, launched arrows at exposed Persian flanks. But they were too few. The main Egyptian force stood paralyzed, watching their doom approach one step at a time. Psamtik's desperate commands, "Fight! Your pharaoh commands you!" fell on ears deafened by faith. At 50 yards, close enough to see the tears in Egyptian eyes, the Persians stopped again. This was the moment of final psychological breaking. They didn't need to attack. They simply waited, letting Egyptian soldiers fully comprehend their situation. The sacred animals continued their cries. The sun climbed higher. Egyptian will crumbled like sand castles before the tide. Then came the moment that shattered Egypt's soul. A single Egyptian archer, his name lost to history, loosed an arrow in frustration or despair. It struck a cat tied to a Persian shield. The animal's death cry pierced the morning air. The Egyptian army collectively gasped. Men fell to their knees. Some began praying for forgiveness. Others simply dropped their weapons and fled. That single arrow had broken more than a battle line. It had broken a civilization's spirit. Then Cambyses gave the order that would echo through eternity: "Advance!" The Persian war machine surged forward, sacred animals and all. What followed was not a battle, but a crisis of faith with bronze points. The Egyptian line didn't break. It simply dissolved, like salt statues in rain. The animal shield advanced relentlessly. Cats tied to shields yowled in fear and fury. Ibises beat their wings against cage bars. Dogs snarled and barked, adding to the cacophony. Persian soldiers moved in perfect discipline behind their living barriers, spears leveled, confidence absolute. They'd trained for this moment in the desert, learning to fight while managing their sacred cargo. Individual Egyptian soldiers faced personal hells. Amenhotep, captain of archers, stood on Pelusium's walls with drawn bow. Below him, a Persian climbed a siege ladder, a white cat strapped across his chest. Amenhotep had killed dozens in border skirmishes. His arrow could punch through bronze armor, but his hands shook. The cat's green eyes seemed to stare directly at him. In that moment, Amenhotep saw not an enemy soldier, but a test from Bastet herself. He lowered his bow. The Persian crested the wall. Amenhotep died on a Persian blade, whispering prayers for forgiveness. But here's where it gets insane. Some Egyptians found ways to resist without committing sacrilege. They aimed for exposed legs, hoping to wound without killing sacred animals. They threw stones instead of shooting arrows. Some tried to use their shields to push Persians back without harming the creatures. But these half measures only delayed the inevitable. The Persian advance under sacred protection was methodical genius. First came the front line with cats on shields. Behind them, a second line carried poles with bird cages, creating a visual barrier of sacred creatures. The third line was conventional heavy infantry, ready to exploit any gap. Cambyses had created the world's first combined arms formation using theological warfare. Step by step, the Persians closed on Egyptian positions. At the fortress gates, Egyptian officers held frantic debates. "We must fight," General Cambyses shouted. "The kingdom depends on us." But High Priest Amenemheb countered, "Better the kingdom fall than the gods abandon Egypt forever." As they argued, Persian battering rams, decorated with images of Egyptian gods, approached the gates. What happened next defied military logic. Some Egyptian units actually helped the Persians. Seeing sacred animals in distress, Egyptian soldiers broke ranks to ensure the creatures weren't harmed in the fighting. One papyrus fragment records an Egyptian sergeant carefully guiding a Persian soldier with a cat shield through his own lines, unable to reconcile duty to pharaoh with duty to the gods. But then, The first major break came on the Egyptian left flank. A unit of Greek mercenaries, less constrained by Egyptian religion, attempted a charge. For a moment, it seemed the tide might turn, but Cambyses had anticipated this. Hidden among the regular Persian troops were special units, carrying the most sacred animals of all: hawks, living symbols of Horus, the god most associated with pharaonic power. When these emerged, even the Greek mercenaries hesitated. Their Egyptian paymasters had made clear: harm Horus's sacred birds, and no amount of gold would save them from execution. Statistical shock. Within the first hour, over 1,000 Egyptians had fallen, without inflicting significant Persian casualties. The killing was one-sided, mechanical. Persians simply walked up to paralyzed Egyptians and struck them down. Some Egyptians didn't even raise their shields, accepting death rather than risk accidentally harming a sacred animal in self-defense. The line breaks began at Pelusium's main gate. Egyptian infantry, pressed back against the fortress walls, faced a choice: stand and die, or flee and live. They chose life. First in trickles, then in floods, Egyptian soldiers abandoned their positions. They threw down weapons, stripped off armor, and ran. The sight of elite troops fleeing broke whatever resolve remained in other units. Psamtik watched his army disintegrate from the fortress walls. The young pharaoh screamed orders, threatened executions, promised rewards. Nothing worked. His generals begged him to sound the retreat, to save what forces remained. But retreat to where? The Persians stood between them and Memphis. This wasn't just a tactical defeat. It was complete, strategic collapse. This is when honor became Egypt's doom. The massacre that followed shocked even hardened Persian veterans. Egyptian soldiers, unable to fight back without risking sacrilege, were cut down by the thousands. The fields before Pelusium became a slaughterhouse. Persian cavalry, their horses decorated with amulets of Egyptian gods, rode down fleeing infantry. Persian archers, standing behind screens of sacred animals, sent arrows into packed masses of Egyptian troops. But then came the only moment of Egyptian glory in that dark day. The Nubian Guard, Psamtik's elite personal troops, made their stand. These warriors from beyond the cataracts followed Egyptian gods, but weren't as paralyzed by Egyptian religious law. Their captain, a giant named Kashta, bellowed to his men, "The gods understand warrior honor. Better to die fighting than live as Persian slaves." The Nubians formed a square, spears out, and actually pushed back the first Persian assault. For 30 minutes, they held a small hill, their disciplined resistance a lone island in an ocean of Egyptian collapse. Cambyses himself took notice, directing reinforcements to surround them. But the Nubians wouldn't break. They sang war songs from their homeland, their deep voices carrying over the screams and clash of bronze. Here's what the Persian records don't want you to know. The Nubian last stand genuinely worried Cambyses. If more Egyptian units showed such resolve, sacred animals or not, the battle could still turn costly. He ordered his men to offer the Nubians terms: surrender and serve Persia with honor. Kashta's response was a thrown spear that nearly took a Persian officer's head. The end came when Persian engineers brought forward a special weapon: mobile cages filled with the most sacred cats from Bubastes, Bastet's holy city. These weren't just any cats. They wore golden collars marking them as temple animals. To harm them wasn't just sacrilege, it was cosmic blasphemy. The Persians pushed these cages toward the Nubian square. Even Kashta's iron will cracked. He couldn't order his men to fight through living avatars of the goddess herself. The Nubian square wavered, loosened, and finally broke. Kashta died as he lived, standing, defiant, his spear red with Persian blood. Of his 300 men, none survived. They'd chosen death over both sacrilege and surrender. The final collapse came with horrifying swiftness. Pelusium's gates, abandoned by their defenders, stood open. Persian troops poured into the fortress city. Egyptian soldiers crowded the docks, desperately seeking boats to escape across the Mediterranean. Others fled south toward Memphis, discarding weapons and armor to run faster. The famous Egyptian military discipline, built over millennia, evaporated in hours. Psamtik's escape attempt became the day's final humiliation. Surrounded by a small guard, the young pharaoh tried to flee through Pelusium's southern gate, but Phanes had anticipated this. Greek mercenaries in Persian service blocked the escape route. The traitor himself appeared, still wearing his Egyptian armor but with a Persian cloak over it. "Your Majesty," he mocked in perfect Egyptian, The gods have spoken. They march with Persia now. The young pharaoh, barely into his 20s, faced his kingdom's destroyer. For a moment, witnesses say, Psamtik seemed ready to charge Phanes personally. Then his shoulders slumped. The weight of the disaster, the impossibility of fighting gods themselves, crushed his spirit. He surrendered his sword, the ceremonial blade of pharaohs, to a Greek traitor in Persian service. Egypt's independence died in that gesture. The aftermath was worse than the battle itself. As the sun reached its zenith, so did the slaughter. 50,000 Egyptian casualties littered the battlefield. The precise number varies between sources, but all agree on the scale. The complete destruction of Egypt's primary military force. Persian losses? Perhaps 7,000, mostly from the Nubian last stand and scattered resistance. But numbers don't capture the true horror. The battlefield reeked not of death alone, but of incense and cat fur mixed with blood and sand. Sacred animals, their purpose served, were carefully collected by Persian soldiers. Most survived. Cambyses had given strict orders that the creatures be unharmed once victory was achieved. They were, after all, still sacred, still useful for controlling the Egyptian population. The Nile ran red with the blood of the faithful. Carrion birds circled overhead, but even they seemed confused by the scene below. So much death, yet so little actual fighting. This wasn't a battlefield in any traditional sense. It was an altar where Egypt sacrificed itself to its own beliefs. With Egypt's army shattered, the empire's fate was sealed. Pelusium fortress fell within a single day. The massive walls that had defied Assyrian siege engines for months crumbled not to Persian engineering, but to Egyptian despair. Defenders simply abandoned their posts. Why defend walls when the gods themselves had switched sides? The race to Memphis began immediately. Cambyses, knowing that speed would prevent Egyptian reorganization, pushed his army hard, but he needn't have worried. The psychological weapon he'd unleashed at Pelusium spread faster than his cavalry. Refugees carried tales of cats defeating armies, of gods abandoning Egypt, of pharaoh surrendering to blasphemers who wielded sacred animals as weapons. Every town between Pelusium and Memphis faced the same choice: resist and face both military destruction and theological damnation, or surrender and hope for mercy. They chose surrender. City after city opened their gates. Local governors prostrated themselves before Cambyses, offering tribute, begging only that he not bring his sacred animal army into their streets. But the real genius wasn't the cats. It was what Cambyses did next. He proclaimed that the gods of Egypt had chosen him as their true champion. The sacred animals proved it. He wasn't conquering Egypt. He was liberating it from a pharaoh who'd lost divine favor. This message, crafted with Phanes' insight into Egyptian psychology, transformed invasion into theological inevitability. Psamtik, racing toward Memphis with remnants of his guard, found no sanctuary. The ancient capital was in chaos. Priests debated whether the gods had truly abandoned them. Citizens rioted, some calling for resistance, others for immediate surrender. The young pharaoh's authority evaporated like morning mist. He'd ruled for 6 months. He would rule for perhaps 6 more days. The siege of Memphis was no siege at all. Cambyses arrived to find the gates open, a delegation of priests and nobles waiting with surrender terms. They asked only that Persian troops respect the temples, that sacred animals remain unharmed, that Egyptian religious law be maintained. Cambyses agreed to everything. Why not? These same religious laws had delivered him an empire. Then the unthinkable happened. Some Egyptians began switching sides voluntarily. If the gods marched with Persia, they reasoned, then opposing Persia meant opposing the gods. Temple guards joined Persian ranks. Egyptian sailors offered their ships to transport Persian supplies. The theological logic was inescapable. Divine will had manifested through sacred cats on shields. Psamtik's final stand at Memphis lasted 3 days. Holed up in the palace with loyalists, he tried to organize resistance, but his calls to arms fell on deaf ears. When Persian soldiers, still carrying their sacred animals, surrounded the palace, even his personal guard wavered. The end came not with a battle, but with a negotiation. Psamtik would surrender if his family was spared. The surrender ceremony was carefully orchestrated for maximum humiliation. Psamtik, wearing the royal regalia of 1,000 pharaohs, walked through Memphis streets to kneel before Cambyses. Persian soldiers lined the route, sacred cats still tied to their shields, a reminder of how Egypt fell. The young pharaoh placed his crown at the Persian's feet. 3 millennia of native rule ended with that gesture. Cambyses' immediate actions surprised everyone. He proclaimed himself pharaoh, yes, but also high priest of Ptah. He performed the proper rituals, spoke the proper words, wore the proper garments. This wasn't mere conquest, it was absorption. Egypt wouldn't be destroyed, it would be digested into the Persian Empire while maintaining its cultural identity. The executions began selectively. Egyptian generals who'd fled at Pelusium faced death for cowardice, but priests who'd counseled surrender received rewards. The message was clear. Resistance meant death. Cooperation meant continuity. Most Egyptian nobles chose continuity. They kept their lands, their titles, even their local authority. They simply reported to Persian satraps instead of Egyptian pharaohs. What Psamtik screamed in that moment has been lost to history, but his fate wasn't. Initially, Cambyses showed mercy. The former pharaoh became a guest in the Persian court, technically honored but practically imprisoned. For months, Psamtik played the broken puppet, perhaps hoping for eventual restoration. Then came the fatal mistake. Egyptian loyalists in the Delta began organizing resistance. They invoked Psamtik's name, claimed he'd sent secret messages encouraging rebellion. Whether he actually had or not remains unclear. What's certain is that Cambyses' paranoia, that family madness, erupted. Psamtik was accused of treason against the Persian crown he'd never accepted. The execution method was carefully chosen for maximum theological impact. Psamtik was forced to drink bull's blood, a substance Egyptians believed was instantly fatal to those who'd lost divine favor. The young pharaoh drank, convulsed, and died. His death proved the gods had abandoned him. Even in execution, Cambyses wielded Egyptian beliefs as weapons. The death toll's final accounting stunned both sides. Beyond the 50,000 battlefield casualties, thousands more died in the occupation's early days. Some from resistance, some from the chaos of regime change, some from simple despair. Egypt's military elite, the archer corps that had defended the two lands for centuries, essentially ceased to exist. An entire martial tradition died at Pelusium. Persian administrative takeover proceeded with ruthless efficiency. Satraps replaced nomarchs. Persian garrison troops occupied key fortresses. Egyptian tax collection, famously efficient, simply changed its destination from Memphis to Persepolis. The Nile still flooded, crops still grew, trade still flowed. For average Egyptians, life continued much as before, except now they were ruled by those who'd weaponized their own gods against them. But modern archaeologists found evidence that changes the entire story. Papyrus fragments from Elephantine describe Egyptian priests conducting secret rituals to cleanse the sacrilege of Pelusium. They believed the gods hadn't abandoned Egypt. They'd been temporarily deceived by Persian trickery. This theological reasoning planted seeds for future rebellions. Egypt would accept Persian rule, but never Persian legitimacy. And then Cambyses revealed why he really came to Egypt. It wasn't just conquest. It was preparation. Egypt's wealth would fund expeditions into Nubia and Libya. Egyptian grain would feed Persian armies marching further into Africa. The ancient kingdom had become a Persian resource center, its independence sacrificed to continental ambitions. But the battle's end was just the beginning of Egypt's transformation. Egypt would remain a Persian satrapy for the next 200 years, with brief periods of rebellion and autonomy. But something fundamental had broken at Pelusium. The Egyptian belief in their own divine invincibility, the certainty that the gods would always protect the two lands, never fully recovered. Future pharaohs, even native ones during brief restorations, ruled with the knowledge that faith could be weaponized, that piety could become paralysis. The cultural changes ran deep. Persian administrative systems merged with Egyptian bureaucracy, creating hybrid governmental forms that would persist through Ptolemaic and Roman periods. Egyptian art began incorporating Persian motifs. Winged discs joined solar barges. Ahura Mazda stood beside Ra. The theological implications were staggering. If Persian gods and Egyptian gods could coexist, what did that mean for cosmic order? But Cambyses' innovation outlived his empire. The Battle of Pelusium became a tactical textbook for psychological warfare. Alexander the Great, conquering Egypt 2 centuries later, made sure to honor Egyptian gods ostentatiously. Roman generals studied Pelusium to understand how belief systems could be exploited. The lesson was clear: know your enemy's soul, and you own their sword. What if the Egyptians had fired? Historians have debated this counterfactual for millennia. If Egyptian archers had accepted damnation and loosed their arrows, would Persia have won anyway? Probably. Their numerical advantage and strategic position were significant, but the casualties would have been far higher, the conquest bloodier, the occupation more difficult. By refusing to fight, Egypt made its own conquest swift and total. The tactical innovation, using cultural knowledge as a weapon, revolutionized ancient warfare. After Pelusium, commanders increasingly studied enemy religions, taboos, and social structures. Wars became as much about psychology as logistics. The sacred animal shield was never replicated exactly, but its principle, 1C, turning enemy beliefs against them, became standard strategy. Modern military theorists still reference Pelusium when discussing psychological operations. The battle demonstrates how cultural intelligence can be more valuable than traditional reconnaissance. Knowing what your enemy can't do, what their own beliefs forbid, creates opportunities that no amount of force can match. In asymmetric warfare, understanding psychological constraints often matters more than counting troops. The fall of Egypt's last native dynasty changed the ancient world's trajectory. Without Egyptian independence, the cultural flowering of the late period ended. The Persians redirected Egyptian resources toward their own imperial projects. The Mediterranean's balance of power shifted permanently. Greece rose partly because Egypt couldn't counterbalance Persian expansion. History pivoted on the pause of an archer's hand. For Egypt itself, Pelusium marked the end of true sovereignty. Even when native dynasties briefly returned, they ruled a changed land. The ancient certainties were gone. The gods might protect Egypt, but they could also be used against it. Faith remained, but tempered with doubt. The pyramids still stood, but the civilization that built them had fundamentally transformed. In war, knowing your enemy's soul beats knowing their strategy. Cambyses proved that the strongest fortress is worthless if defenders won't man the walls. The sharpest arrows are useless if archers won't draw their bows. The greatest faith becomes the greatest weakness when turned against itself. And so the civilization that built monuments to eternity fell to an army of cats. The pharaohs who'd ruled for 3,000 years were defeated not by Persian steel, but by Egyptian souls. In the end, Bastet conquered Egypt more thoroughly than Cambyses ever could. The age of pharaohs ended with a meow, not a roar.